A lot of people out there reckon that this new Defender isn't going to be as tough or as capable as the old Defender, that one that has been around for years, a classic recipe of live axles, coil springs and a ladder chassis. This new Defender is anything but old. It's new, all new tech on an all new platform. We're going to be one of the first people in the world to put this new Defender through its paces. We're in northern Namibia and we've got some really tough terrain ahead. I'm talking swollen rivers, I'm talking deep sand, I'm talking rough mountain passes. Just about everything that will test out things like clearance, things like suspension, things like durability and traction. And to those people who reckon it's not tough enough, Land Rover has some interesting points to make. This new Defender will pick up the baton of Land Rover's very first model, which spans back to 1948. At the time, it was simply called the Land Rover. Famously sketched on a beach and rushed into production using whatever they can get their hands on in post-war Britain, it was a raging success and continued on virtually unchanged until 4 years ago. Some mechanical bits have happened over the years, coil springs, full-time four-wheel drive and different drivetrains, but the basic recipe was always the same. This was a four-wheel drive hell-bent on pure utility, payload, capability, bushability and ruggedness. That old Defender refused to get with the times. It had no airbags. It had zero consideration for pedestrian safety. It had less curves than a tissue box. And it only just had an interior. Ergonomics, comfort, best not go there. After production wound up, Land Rover had no Defender for 4 long years. Imagine Porsche without a 911, Jeep without a Wrangler, or Toyota without a Land Cruiser. I put those right up there with the likes of Land Rover not having a Defender. But now it's back, and it's radically different. The new Defender is built on an all-new platform. Land Rover calls it D7X, and that X stands for Extreme. They tell us that they've put it through 62,000 individual tests to sign off if it's strong enough. They've already put millions of kilometers on prototypes around the world as well. It's all pretty impressive. There's a new steel subframe in this chassis, and Land Rover have put stronger bushings in and ball joints as well. And they've tested 7-ton vertical loads in through these wheels, and the car will handle it. Naturally, this Defender needs to be good off-road. It's got 290 mils of ground clearance thanks to that air suspension. That also gives you 500 mils of articulation because those airbags are cross-linked, so it kind of mimics a live axle in a way. There's 900 mils of wading depth. There's even a snorkel on this one over on the far side there. That's all pretty impressive stuff. The car we're driving here has an optional roof rack that can handle 300 kilos of static load or about 170 in terms of dynamic load. So if you're on a bit of an adventure like this one, we've got a spare wheel up there, shovel, a couple of max tracks as well. You can load it up with gear and it's all within spec. Personal favourite of mine are these steel wheels. They're 18-inch wheels, which is pretty good in terms of aftermarket tyres, but in terms of factory tyres, you can get these Goodyear Duratracs, which are a decent tyre off-road. And if you do get stuck, 6.5 tonnes of snatch load through those rated points, and that's a factory fitment, really good. And it's got a very flat back, this Defender, with a spare on the back there, very reminiscent of the old one. The one great thing about that is the departure angle. It's magnificent. But does this new recipe do justice to the Defender's legacy? Land Rover has given us early access to some pre-production Defenders, and we've got some serious forward driving on the menu. On-road driving impressions will be minimal because we're in the remote Kanini region and bitumen is rare. There's a green Defender D240 that has a starting price of $75,900. That's a base specification with a more powerful 177 kilowatt, 430 Newton meter 2-litre diesel engine. The silver example is a P400S, which costs $95,700, and that's powered by a 294 kilowatt, 550 Newton meter inline 6 3-litre turbo petrol. Both have an 8-speed automatic gearbox. There is no manual option in the Defender range anymore. Full-time four-wheel drive, low range, terrain response 2 and locking rear and centre differentials. And while Land Rover quotes up to 900 kilos worth of payload in the Defender range, our 2 test vehicles have payloads of 740 kilos for the petrol and 767 kilos for the diesel. This is the interior of the new Defender, and Land Rover's done a fantastic job of combining some old design elements with a lot of new technology. This dashboard here is very reminiscent of old Defenders with grab handles on the end, really exposed stuff here, and what is kind of like a big long Jesus bar on the front there for off-roading. Below that is an infotainment display that's all new for Jaguar Land Rover. It's called Pivi. It's a new system, a lot of connectivity there, software updates over the air, all sorts of modern tech, and that's obviously a massive improvement over the old one. Pretty cool. There's USB points, there's 12 volt, there's even a USB-C there, and also a gear shifter which is mounted up on the dashboard. It's a little bit different, but for a good reason, because you can opt for a jump seat in the middle. So 3 across the front, just like old Land Rovers, pretty cool. And some of the guys on this trip have been using it and they reckon it's quite comfortable, even on the longer drives. And if you do have that included, you do get a pretty fancy rear view camera, which actually doubles as a video display. It picks up a camera which is mounted off the shark fin antenna on the roof. It's really clear, and it means it doesn't matter how loaded up your car is with people in gear, you can still see exactly what's going on behind you. Next to the gear stick here, you've got your dual zone climate control, plus all of your vehicle controls. So that's terrain response 2, low range, air suspension heights, hill descent control, all that sort of stuff is here. And while you're driving, it's actually really easy to get around what you need with a few buttons on there. And it leaves a really clean design overall. There's a digital instrument display up the front here, which you can cycle through all things like tire pressure monitoring, different speeds, all sorts of things. And this new steering wheel, it's got a bit of that magnesium, which is the same as this front bit there. That's structural, this obviously isn't, but it's a new design. I think it looks great. A few buttons on the front there. Awesome interior overall. This new Defender does not have a 110-inch wheelbase anymore. It's more like 118 actually. Now that might annoy the purists a little bit, but it's for good reason. The second row here, that's my driving position. Up front, I've got loads of leg room, fair amount of headroom too. And in terms of width, it's quite good. You could fit 3 adults in the back here pretty well. In terms of appointments, once again, you've got your climate control and vents down here. More power outlets than you can poke a stick at, to be honest with you. Great visibility too, and the seats, these are cloth, the more basic trim, but they're really comfortable. Off-road, there's no denying that this new Defender is supremely capable and adept. It does it in a different manner than the old Defender, which really relied on old school technology for good off-road ability. Facts are facts, however. There's more clearance and more traction aids available on this new Defender, thanks to independent suspension, locking rear and centre diffs, and big tyres. Those are 815 mils in diameter, by the way, which is 32 inches in the old money. It's got decent articulation available because that air suspension is cross-linked. If one side tucks up, valves between the airbags push air to the other side, which pushes it down. It's kind of like a live axle. Rear articulation is pretty good with long control arms, while the front is a bit more modest. But I have to say the Defender has a great feeling of overall stability through ruts and on funny angles. We put it to some good testing on some steep and tricky mountain passes where the Defender barely touched down, or to be honest, put a foot wrong. Aside from hair trigger brakes that made smooth progress hard to master, the Defender is a confidence-inspiring off-roader. Visibility is good, and the different driving modes in Terrain Response 2 makes the Defender much easier to manage off-road. This new Defender proved to be very effective in soft sand as well, especially with that near 300 kilowatt engine under the bonnet. With tyre pressures still high and the sand mode selected, it was able to maintain a lot of momentum and plenty of wheel speed through the soft stuff. Only when we stopped at a couple of soft patches did the cars need recovery. Driving this new Defender is a really interesting experience. It's this funny combination of old and new stuff all at the same time. Sitting in the driver's seat here, driving through some pretty spectacular country in northern Namibia. But I can see this bonnet design, no more flat windscreen anymore, but you've got this sense of Defender whilst driving this car. When you look at the dashboard, even though there is a big infotainment display there, dual zone climate control, automatic transmission, all these things the old Defender didn't have, they've done a great job of designing the interior like a bit of a homage to the old one. Grab handles on the end here, the magnesium on the front, it does work. One thing that is definitely not Defender is the way it drives. Naturally, it's completely different under the skin to the old one. And this drives with a lot more comfort, a lot more refinement, and a lot more control at the same time. Currently barreling along here, doing about 80, 90 kilometers an hour on some fairly rough and corrugated tracks, and our tyres aren't let down very low. 35 pounds in the rear and 30 in the front. It's a bit high for my personal taste, but it is a really good demonstration of what this suspension is capable of. Air suspension, The shocks are fairly dynamic and they're a big shock absorber as well, and they give you lots of absorption, similar to high performance off-road shocks, but at the same time there's lots of control, lots of feedback in the steering wheel and that sort of thing. It's an enjoyable car to drive at speed, and you can't necessarily say that for the old Defender. I'm currently driving the diesel powered model. It's the D240, so it's 177 kilowatt twin turbo 2 litre diesel, and there's 430 newton meters there, which isn't a huge number, but it is available from 1400 RPM, which is right where you want it for a car like this. The biggest takeaway for me though is how refined that engine is. You can barely hear it going even when it gets up towards that 4000 RPM red line. It feels like the car might be a little bit sluggish. The throttle pedal is definitely a long travel off-road style feel, which can be doughy. It can feel doughy at times until you get used to it, but it's not until you actually look at the speedo you see how much speed you're doing. This isn't a fast car, but it definitely isn't a slow one either. It's got great brakes, they perform really well, but perhaps a little bit touchy in some situations. Land Rover told us that they are working on that and they're looking to calibrate it for a little bit more give in the off-road scenario, so you can do that crawling in low speed stuff. But that big $1 million question, of course, is does it feel like a new Defender? And I think it does enough. Real lovers of the old one are probably going to criticize this thing too much, too comfortable, too safe, too much air conditioning, you know, heated seats, that's not very Defender, right? However, in most disciplines, it is a better car. It's quieter, more enjoyable, more comfortable, and I think it is more capable than the old one. Don't forget that you've got a lot of advanced traction aids with this car. Center diff lock, rear diff lock, all these electronic gizmos which you can access through the dashboard here make a big difference to how good this thing is off-road. But it does have that sense of the old one floating about, even though it is, in a lot of senses, a much better vehicle overall. This new Defender is no doubt very impressive, and it carries on the Defender name quite proudly, but it does it in a different manner. If you're looking for something like a Land Cruiser or a Jimny or a Wrangler, traditional four-wheel drives with that old school feel, the new Defender is not like that. But at the same time, it still does what the old one does. It's got big payloads, it's got a good towing capacity, and in rough terrain, it is capable. And in terms of durability, we've driven this thing in some rough roads, we've been going quick, we've been going hard, trying to catch up time, driving into the night, all sorts of things, and we haven't had any issues, so that's a big thumbs up. And you've got to remember that Land Rover's tradition is always of trying to move the game forward, and that's what this Defender does. You have to remember that they pioneered things like coil springs, terrain response, permanent four-wheel drive, air suspension even. This Defender is moving the game forward, not just for Defender, but for the whole Land Rover family. And that brings other things that aren't normally associated with Defender, like climate control, infotainment, comfort, refinement. This thing is seriously smooth to drive on rough roads, and you can barely hear that engine under load. It's all very, very impressive. The small caveat is that these are pre-production models, but what you see is largely what you will get when this lands in Australia later in the year. But when they do come, check out caradvice.com because we're going to be putting the Australian delivered Defender through its paces.